You bring the jury. All righty. You may proceed.
I think we're about at this point. Where did Officer Slager indicate that he had initiated his license out?
In the area of Remount Road and Dakota Street.
And what did the Mercedes do, according to Officer Slager?
It yielded to the middle lane and pulled over into the Advanced Auto.
And what happened after the vehicle pulled into the Advanced Auto?
The defendant made contact out of his vehicle, made contact with the driver, later identified to be Walter Scott, of the Mercedes. He asked him for his license and registration. He was able to obtain the license. He put it in his belt. Mr. Scott told him
What was Mr. Scott doing when he approached his car?
his hands were in his pockets.
And what was the passenger doing?
The passenger was doing nothing. He said it was as if it was almost like he wasn't being stopped.
Now, what did Officer Slager say that Mr. Scott told him regarding the insurance and registration?
It said that he didn't have it, that he had changed his story saying that he was going to buy the vehicle, that he was supposed to buy it from a friend on Monday.
And what did Officer Slager tell him?
He said, let's start with your license. He obtained the license.
And what did he do with the license?
He said he put it in his duty belt like he does with all licenses.
And then what did he do?
He then went back to his car and was going to start. He hit the touchpad, he said, on his in-car computer to run the NCIC check on the license.
Okay, before going back to his car, what did he tell Mr. Scott regarding the insurance?
He said, oh, if you bought the car, you're going to have to get insurance. You need to get insurance.
And what did Mr. Scott do when he told him that? When he told him that?
He changed his story, said he was going to buy it on Monday. His friend was going to buy it.
What did Officer Slager say concerning what he knew about the occupants of the car and at that time?
I'd asked him about what he'd seen prior to the stop. He said he only saw it from behind, had seen the brake light out. He couldn't observe anything regarding the race or identity of the persons inside the vehicle.
When did he say he first saw the passenger in the car?
When he got up to the doorpost.
And once again, what did he say the passenger was doing?
So just sitting still, looking straight ahead, didn't look at or acknowledge anyone. So it was like he wasn't even being stopped.
What did Officer Slager indicate that he smelled, if anything?
He didn't smell any marijuana or anything of unusual.
Did he note what was the only thing that was unusual that stuck out to him?
Just the movements, the hands in the pockets and so forth.
And Officer Slager said that he had changed his story.
He said that, yes, that he had changed his story about buying the car and when he was going to buy it or and so forth.
Now, what did he do when he got to his, Officer Slager do when he got to his car?
He hit the touchpad to go in and run, to run the driver's license information, or attempted to.
And what happened as he hit the touchpad?
The driver of the car, Mr. Scott, got out of the car, got out of the driver's side and stood and looked at him.
And what did he tell the driver to do?
He told him to get back in the vehicle.
And what did the driver do?
He got back in the car.
And you note, say, looked around some, moved his arms. What does that mean?
Noted that, yeah, he looked around some and moved his arms, but he got back in.
And I believe he initially told you that the stop was at AutoZone, is that correct?
He'd initially identified it as AutoZone. It was then clarified that he had meant Advance Auto, and we noted that.
And where was the Mercedes parked at Advance Auto, and what was in front of it?
It was parked in a space, there was a curb between where they were parked and the street there, Craig Street.
So what did Officer Slager do after he instructed Mr. Scott to get back in the car and Mr. Scott complied?
He got back into his own car, sat back down, looked up a couple of seconds later, and Mr. Scott had gotten back out of the car and took off running down Craig Street.
And what did Officer Slager do?
He opened his car door, took a couple of steps, called in that he was 1080 down Craig Street, and took off running after Mr. Scott.
Did he describe what Mr. Scott was wearing?
Yeah, he said he called out a description of the shirt he was wearing. He didn't remember at the time of the interview exactly what description he called out.
And did he explain why he'd run after him?
He said he hadn't had a chance to run the person's license, that it was still in his belt. He had thought about why he had changed his story and so forth, so he went running after him.
So he ran after him because he hadn't had a chance to run his license?
That's what he stated there, yes. And the fact that his story had changed.
Okay. And so where did the driver go?
He went running down Craig and got to a yellow road. It's a yellow path where the incident took place. He ran to the yellow road and turned onto the road.
And what did Officer Slager do?
He pulled out his taser and yelled, "Taser, taser, taser."
And how far was the driver away from him?
Said approximately 12 to 15 feet.
Did he indicate why he wasn't able to catch up to Mr. Scott?
He said Mr. Scott was running about the same speed as he was.
So he wasn't making up any ground?
Correct. He said he was running about the same speed as him. I couldn't catch him.
Did he indicate why he yelled taser?
He said that's what he's been trained to do. He's been taser certified for approximately 5 years, and they trained him to say that.
And what did he say Mr. Scott did when he yelled taser, taser, taser?
He said Mr. Scott turned his body and started making a swatting motion behind him, which he believed was him trying to maybe swat away the oncoming taser probes. He said that was his perception. He said he had seen people do this before, and he had heard other officers describe subjects doing so.
Did he demonstrate this for
He
you?
did. He demonstrated by turning and waving
You
on,
can stand up if that's enough.
by turning and waving an arm behind him as he ran. Continued to run.
Okay. What did he say that Mr. Scott had in his hand?
What he believed to be a phone or some other object. He had seen a phone in the car earlier and believed that was what it was.
And did he say where he'd seen the phone earlier in the car?
In the center cubby hole below, or where the ashtray would be, he said he saw the face of it lit up during the stop.
Did he indicate whether or not he thought the phone was operational at the time that he
He
saw it?
said he believed that it was on speaker throughout the traffic stop.
So back to where we were, he said he was chasing and Mr. Scott was moving his right arm behind him.
Yes.
What did he say? What did he say he was doing?
He said he's running with the taser out. He knew not to shoot while he's making that swatting motion. He said that Mr. Scott then turned back and resumed a running position, at which point he deployed the taser.
And what did he say happened when he deployed the taser?
Said that one of the prongs went into Mr. Scott's upper left back. The other, he didn't know where it went. He heard tick, tick, tick noise. He said that information alerted him that the prongs had not made contact and therefore would not incapacitate him.
I'm sorry,
Therefore would not incapacitate him. The current would not be made. Connection was not formed.
And he indicated that Mr. Scott was not incapacitated, is that correct?
Correct.
And I believe he also indicated about a 5-second burst. Tell us about that.
He said the initial pull on a trigger is a 5-second burst from the taser. And it was not going to be sending that pulse because the probes did not make contact.
So what did Mr. Scott do after this first taser deployment failed?
He continued running, and the defendant was telling him to stop.
Still chasing him?
Still chasing him. He then pulled the first cartridge off and reloaded the taser from the spare cartridge on the bottom.
Okay. Did he indicate how many cartridges he had with him?
He said that he had 2. He speculated there might have been a third one in the glove box, but that they were issued 2. And that's what he didn't have any additional cartridges on his belt.
Okay, so he had 2 with him at this time.
Yes.
And I believe next in your chronology, you indicate what he was wearing. Why is that? Officer Slager was wearing, why is that?
That's something we ask in pretty much all of these interviews is to ask the officer what they were wearing during the incident. And he went into detail about wearing his department-issued uniform, boots, socks, shirt. His vest is on underneath his department-issued shirt. And then he drives a Mark 2011 North Charleston Crown Victoria car. He's got his badge and his equipment on.
Now, what did he say happened after he ejected the first cartridge and reloaded the second cartridge?
He said that they're continuing to run. He's reloaded it, and he fires the taser again. Says they're a little closer this time, maybe 8 to 10 feet as opposed to approximately 15 the first time he fires it. He noted that the cartridges have a range of approximately 25 feet.
Did he indicate that both of he and Mr. Scott were still moving at the time of the second taser deployment?
Yes.
And what happened when he deployed this taser the second time?
The prongs hit Mr. Scott. He locked up and fell down on his front, fell on the yellow path. He said he made the shot on the run.
And what did Officer Slager say about his condition at this time?
He said that he was winded. His adrenaline was starting to come down. He's getting tired.
He was referring to himself.
To himself, yes.
And what did he indicate that he saw when Mr. Scott went down to the ground in front of him?
He saw what he believed to be a black phone or some other black object fall down on the path in front of him. And he could hear a voice coming from somewhere.
Okay, what did he hear this voice say?
He said, stop, do what the officer says. He said he hoped it was another officer, but coming to help, but it wasn't.
And what did he realize when he knew it wasn't another officer?
He saw the phone laying on the ground and realized that the voice was coming from the phone. So he heard it 2 or 3 times.
Heard what 2 or 3 times?
The voice from the phone
Saying what?
saying things like stop, saying stop, things to that effect is what he said.
And what did he, Officer Slager said he told Mr. Scott after he had gone to the ground?
He said he's standing next to him saying, "Stop resisting, put your hands behind your back." He's at his right side near Mr. Scott's hip area, knee and hip area.
And what did he indicate that Mr. Scott did?
Said that Mr. Scott then moved his hands to a push-up position. The 5-second burst from the taser, he said, was already over with, so he was able to move. He's pushing up on all fours. And
Now, while this story was being related to you, was there any demonstrations going on?
yes, around this time, and as I noted, the defendant and Levi Miles, who again was David Edler's investigator and was present, they began demonstrating this encounter in the floor of the conference room as we conducted the interview.
And you continued to take notes as these actions were demonstrated by them?
Yes, and we asked, I believe Agent Peterson specified, but asked them to make sure they were also narrating the actions they were taking so that we could properly record them.
Okay, so what did Officer Slager do when he said Mr. Scott pushed up on all fours?
Mr. Slager said he still had a taser in his right hand. He pushed down Mr. Scott with his left hand. Mr. Scott started to get up again. He's got his hand in the center of his back near the shoulder blades. He's pushing him down. He notes that he's still tired and winded from running. And he notes that he's not, the defendant noted that I'm not a very strong guy, or I'm not a real strong guy.
And what did he say Scott was yelling at the time?
He said, "Scott's yelling out, I ran down Remont," or calling out Remount Road, what he believed to be calling out locations, the location where he was at.
To the person he was talking to on the phone?
To the voice on the phone, is what he believed.
And what did Officer Slager tell him to do?
He told him to put his hands behind his back. He reached to grab his left arm and put it behind his back. When he tried to do this, he couldn't get it there. And that as he was pulling, Mr. Scott came up with him. He's reaching for the hand. Mr. Scott rolls over onto his left and onto his back and starts raising his hips up.
And what did Officer Slager do at that point?
He said he put his left hand down on Mr. Scott's chest, upper chest area below his neck, trying to hold him down. He was wiggling, they were both wiggling on the ground. The taser's still in the defendant's right hand. He said he used his forearm on the sternum area, as he described, like this, to hold him down. He put it straight on the body. Mr. Scott's still trying to get up. He put his right arm on the ground, was wiggling, trying to get away, and trying to push Officer Slager off with his left hand to his chest area.
So
Chester soldier.
Mr. Scott was trying to push Officer Slager off of him with his hand on his?
Yes, sorry, with his left hand, yes. His right hand's on the ground, left hand up.
Okay, on Officer Slager's chest, correct?
Chest or shoulder area, he clarifies.
What did Officer Slager tell you at that time regarding his thoughts on the continued efficacy of the taser?
He said he felt at that point that the taser wires that had connected at that point had probably broke due to the scuffling on the ground, and therefore he didn't believe it would be effective.
So what did he do?
He demonstrated that he took the taser, he brought the taser, he was holding him down with one hand. He brought the taser to that hand, removed the cartridge, and then took it and drive stunned Mr. Scott in the ribs and on his left side.
Did he indicate how many times he deployed the taser during this incident?
Yeah, I asked him just to make sure, because we talked about several deployments this time, how many times total he believed he deployed the taser, and he described 3. The first one that was fired that didn't make a connection, the second one which put Mr. Scott on the ground, and the third one which was the drive stun without a cartridge to the ribs he had just described.
Now, what happened after he drive stunned Mr. Scott with the taser?
He said that he knew that Mr. Scott would be out of it for a bit, so he reached up with his left hand and called for 156, which is Officer Clarence Habersham, told him to step it up.
he say his concern was at the time?
He said he was worried that because he had been calling out locations on the phone, that someone could be coming to assist or Mr. Scott. He thought of Clarence Habersham because he's another officer that's assigned to Zone 4, the same zone he's in. So he asked him to step it up, which meant get there quickly.
And did he indicate whether or not he was still holding Mr. Scott down at the time that he radioed Officer Habersham?
He indicated that because he had taken his left hand, which had been holding Mr. Scott down, up to activate his shoulder mic, he was no longer holding him down, and he had the taser still in his right hand at this point.
And what did he say Mr. Scott did at that point?
He said that Mr. Scott, using his left hand, grabbed the barrel of the taser and started.
And what did Officer Slager do?
Officer Slager tried to pull it back, but couldn't. He was
Tried to pull it back with which hand?
with his right hand.
And what was Officer Slager doing with his left hand?
He's pushing Mr. Scott down with his left hand.
Okay. And then what happened?
He said that he wasn't able to get it, that he wouldn't let up. He was pulling back, but Mr. Scott had tension on it, was pulling it tight. He then said Mr. Scott reached up with his right arm and grabbed both hands on the taser and then pulled and was able to pull the taser out of the defendant's hand. Jerked it out of his hand, he said.
And what did he say that Mr. Scott did after he jerked the taser out of Officer Slager's hand?
He describes him maneuvering it around with both hands and pointing it towards him, and the defendant said he was looking right at the taser, at which point the defendant said he pulled away.
He said he pulled away. How?
He demonstrated with both arms pushing away from Mr. Scott's chest. He had said initially that he used his left hand, but he demonstrated physically that it was both hands, and then he clarified that he put his hands on his body somewhere to push away.
And what did he say Mr. Scott was doing at the time?
Said that he was rotating left with his body to get back on his feet.
And as Officer Slager was said, he was pushing away from him. What did he say Mr. Scott was doing?
Said he was following him, pointing the taser at him as he came up.
As Mr. Scott came up on his feet?
Yes.
What did he say that he believed Mr. Scott was trying to do with the taser?
He said he believed he was trying to hit him with the taser. He said, oh yes, definitely.
And did he describe what he meant by hitting him with the taser?
He just said he was trying to hit me with the taser. He said he didn't know if Mr. Scott was able to actually activate the trigger.
Did you, in other words, did you take that to mean use the taser against him or use the taser to
I
strike?
took it to mean using the taser against him, tasing him.
Okay. He said he did not know if Mr. Scott was able to activate the taser, you said?
Yes.
And what did he tell you then?
Yeah, he said he was afraid. He said he was worried if he was going to tase him and take his weapon away. Is he going to go home to his pregnant wife that night? Is he going to take my weapon and shoot me? He said his actions, the running away, the swatting, told him that Mr. Scott didn't want to go to jail.
And then back to the narrative, he indicated that Mr. Scott was rotating towards him.
Yes.
And what did Officer Slager do?
Slager said he was getting up, he was winded, tired, said that Mr. Scott's arms were extended up, he's on his feet. Mr. Slager said he was still breathing tired, he was breathing heavy, and he was still tired.
And was this all still being demonstrated by Mr. Miles and Mr. Slager?
Yes.
This was going on?
Yes, they were still demonstrating on the floor.
And then what did he tell you again about what he was thinking?
Said he was in fear of his life.
And what did Mr. Scott do?
Said Mr. Scott took a step forward and was coming at me, taser directly pointed at me in his right hand.
And where was Officer Slager focused?
He said he was focused right on the taser, the barrel coming straight at me.
What did he say about the location of Mr. Scott's left hand?
He said that he didn't know where his left hand was at that point, that the taser was in his right hand.
And what did he do at this point?
He said and described that he stepped off to the left side, to his left,
Slager's
the
left?
defendant's left, and then he shuffle stepped to the side like he was trained to get out of the way.
And what did he do, say he was doing while he shuffle stepped to the left?
He said after he shuffle stepped to the left, he pulled his gun, fired, moved over to the side. Said he could see Mr. Scott turning. He ran off, stumbled into the grass, and fell over to the side.
And where was his gun at that time?
The defendant's gun was still on Mr. Scott, he said, pointing at him when he fell down.
Let me ask you a question here. They were still demonstrating this incident at this time. Is that true?
Yes, that's true.
Was it related to you by Officer Slager that this incident occurred in close proximity?
Yes.
And did he indicate to you that Mr. Scott was coming at him with the taser extended?
Taser extended, yes, coming towards him.
And he stepped back into the side and drew his weapon, correct?
Yes, he stepped back and sidestepped to the left and fired.
And where did he indicate that Mr. Scott was when he fired his weapon?
He said that Mr. Scott was also turning to his left, and was continuing to turn away from him in the opposite direction while he was moving also.
And that's when he shot when Mr. Scott was starting to turn?
Yes.
And I believe we left off, he still had his gun on Mr. Scott when he fell. What did he indicate about stepping backwards and to the side?
He said he took steps backwards, shuffled to the left, and fired, as he was trained to do.
And once again, Mr. Scott was doing what as he was firing?
Said he was turning to his left with the taser extended.
How many steps did he say that Mr. Scott went after he fired at him with his service weapon?
He said he takes 10, 12 steps and then falls on his face in the grass.
And what did he indicate he radioed at that point?
He said he called out the 223, his call sign to dispatch, shots fired, subject or suspect down. He wasn't sure how he referred to him.
And then what did he do?
He said he went up and handcuffed him.
And what did he see when he handcuffed him?
He saw a bunch of blood on Mr. Scott's right side.
What did he indicate with regard to checking Mr. Scott's vital sign?
He said, I handcuffed him and I felt for his pulse. And then he noted that his adrenaline was going again, his own adrenaline.
Did he indicate how many shots he believed he fired?
He said he thought he fired a total of 6 shots.
And I believe at this point there was some break, is that correct?
Yeah, I noted that at that point, Mr. Ayler, Mr. Miles, and the defendant got up to take a break, leave the room. Mr. Ayler made a comment about the defendant possibly getting confused. They stepped out for approximately 2 minutes and then came back in.
Okay. And when they returned, Mr. Ayler told Mr. Slager to start where?
Back when they were getting up off the ground.
And what did Mr. Slager indicate at that point?
He mentioned that the confrontation lasted about 30 seconds to a minute, all told. He said we were both getting up and he had the taser in the right hand. He was coming towards him. He stepped back, shuffle stepped to the left, pulled his weapon and fired.
And after that, he said, when I shuffled to the left, what?
When we were going over the notes at the end of the interview, we gave an opportunity to make any corrections or additions, and he noted during that review that when I shuffled to the left, I just stopped firing. I just started firing.
And once again, he indicated that Mr. Scott, after he discharged his weapon, did what?
He stumbled into the grass, fell into the grass over to the left between the brick road and the fence.
At this point, did you ask him what kind of weapon he was using at the time?
I did. I asked him about his issued weapon. He said it was a Glock 21, 45 caliber, held 13 or 14 rounds. He said he carried it fully loaded and topped off.
And what did he, once again, indicated that he did after Mr. Scott fell to the ground?
He said he handcuffed him.
And where did he say that he located the taser?
So the taser was between where he was shooting and where he, Scott, landed.
Did he indicate how long he was firing?
He said he was firing for about 2 to 3 seconds, and he noted that he didn't know for sure Scott's position during that.
And what did he say he did when he found the taser located between where he was shooting and Mr. Scott's body?
He said he grabbed it and he holstered it because he didn't know who else was coming. Made reference to the phone call and the voices he had heard, and he said he didn't want to leave a weapon laying around.
Who did he indicate arrived at the scene then?
He said the other officers, backup officers, arrived on scene. He noted that Habersham showed up first. I believe Sergeant Gann showed up. Sergeant Webb also showed up, even though he had not been working that day. And Sergeant Webb, I believe, took him to his own vehicle, to Sergeant Webb's vehicle.
And what did Sergeant Webb do with his Officer Slager's weapon?
He took Officer Slager's weapon from him and replaced it with his own weapon.
And did he say that Sergeant Webb retained possession of his weapon?
Not for long. Lieutenant Bowman arrived on scene, and when he found out what had happened, he said no and made him switch back.
And then what did he tell you?
I'm sorry, who?
What did he tell you next?
Oh, he just said he didn't question the whole gun thing. He thought it was for evidence. He said he was tired and a lot of emotions were going through his mind then.
And where did he indicate he was taken?
Again, well, first to Sergeant Webb's car. He also noted that he had seen Sergeant Gann rendering aid along with some other officers, and that EMS came and attended to Mr. Scott. He was put in Sergeant Webb's car. He asked for some water, and then Lieutenant Bowman took him over to his car, which was over on Craig Street. And he was there until he left the scene.
And where was he taken?
To City Hall, to the squad bay.
And what happened at City Hall?
He was met by SLED agent Jamie Johnson, who took possession of his firearm, and taser.
Okay. He indicated that, what did he indicate with regard to the taser after he picked it up and put it in his,
He said he didn't believe anybody else had touched it after that.
said that it stayed in his pocket?
And it stayed in his holster, yes.
And lastly, what did he say about a round check?
He had said he remembered looking at his rounds at one point. He believed it might have been in one of the cars he was sitting in, but wasn't certain.
And what did he mean by a round check?
Meaning to see if he could tell how many rounds he had fired by looking at how many were left.
Now, what time was it when you and Agent Peterson concluded your interview and initial note-taking?
Approximately 12:50 p.m.
So this interview had lasted some hour and 40 minutes, is that correct?
Approximately an hour and 40 minutes, yes.
What happened then?
At that point, Agent Peterson, and myself along with mine, but Agent Peterson read her notes directly back to the defendant in the presence of his attorney and allowed him to make comments, corrections, as noted, to verify the accuracy of what she had done.
So you indicated that you had taken notes and you've identified your notes. Did Angela Peterson take notes during this entire process as well?
Yes, she did.
And it was her notes that Mr. Ayler and Mr. Slager went over?
Yes.
And do you know how long it took them to review Agent Peterson's notes?
That lasted until approximately 1:27 p.m., so approximately 40 minutes, not quite, 40 minutes.
Okay. And did Officer Slager affirm that her notes accurately reflected what happened that day?
Yes, he did.
And was he allowed to make any changes he thought were necessary
Yes,
in Agent Peterson's notes?
yes.
Now, were y'all able to obtain a written statement and show him the video as you had originally planned?
No, we were not able to.
Why was that?
Mr. Ayler had another appointment at 1 o'clock, involving another client and someone who had come in to interview that client, and told us that he was pushing us to conclude the interview. He told us we need to wrap this up.
What did you tell him?
We told him that we'd like to get a written statement. We would like to have a agreed upon signed written statement. We'd hope to get it that day, and provided him statement forms, but we told him and clarified that if we were not able to get that, we reserve the right to take the notes we've taken here today, type them up, and submit them as the record of what we've talked about here.
And were you advised that a statement would be forthcoming?
Yes, we made plans to return. He said he would hopefully have it to us by about 6 p.m. that same day.
So what did you and Ms. Peterson do at that point?
We left, went back to where we met
With the intention of at that time of returning when?
at approximately 6 p.m. If
Now, did you return at 6 p.m.?
we did not,
When did you return?
approximately 4 p.m.
And why did you return earlier?
We had gotten information that the Scott family, with their attorneys, but they were about to release the video to the media. And we wanted the opportunity to be the ones to show him that video first and allow him to comment on it. So we made arrangements to go back earlier.
And did Mr. Ayler agree to make,
I'm sorry?
did Mr. Ayler agree to make himself and Officer Slager available at
Yes.
4 p.m.?
Yes, he did.
Who contacted Mr. Ayler, if you know?
Agent Peterson.
And did y'all go back to the same location, Mr. Ayler's office on
Yes.
Leeds Avenue?
Offices on Leeds Avenue, same place.
And was he advised of his rights again?
He was?
Once again, using a standard SLED Miranda rights form?
Yes.
This would be that form, is that correct?
Yes.
And what time was that done?
I note 4:10 p.m. approximately.
Your Honor, we would offer States 182, I believe, without objection.
Correct. That did without objection.
What were you advised by Mr. Ayler regarding any additional statements?
Objection sustained.
Okay. So what happened then?
We showed both of the videos that had been obtained the night before
To whom?
to Mr. Ayler, Mr. Miles, and the defendant.
And was there any reaction from Officer Slager?
Basis for the objection. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll have you take a break. We tonight discuss the case. Yes, sir, Mr. Savage.
Judge, we had earlier, and I'll try to get it now, that we had filed a motion for some time ago about prohibiting the solicitor from commenting on silence of the defendant. I believe if I had an opportunity to question this witness, he would say that they went to Mr. Ayler's office the second time with the intent to arrest Mr. Slager, regardless of what happened, and that upon arrival, he provided him with his rights, which included the right to remain silent, which Mr. Slager did. And we can't really comment on that. It's prejudicial and inappropriate.
I wasn't actually asking for any verbal thing, I was asking more for a physical reaction, but, you know, if Your Honor feels that's off the limits, I withdraw the question.
But I think specifically the question was
How did he react upon seeing the video? I wasn't asking for any statement or anything, just how did he react? I believe the answer would be there was no reaction.
Well, there's verbal and nonverbal communication, but actually this witness previously provided a statement that Mr. Slager got on his cell phone and was typing communication, which we now know to be false. I don't think any question should be asked of this witness regarding what Mr. Slager did on scene video. So
Right.
it's verbal and non-verbal communication.
it sounds like a Doyle v. Ohio type issue, which precludes the state from offering evidence regarding his silence, post-arrest silence.
I withdraw the question, Your Honor.
The argument is that they intended to arrest him anyway, but he's agreed to withdraw the question. That solves the issue.
Thank you.
All right. Let's take a 2-minute stretch and then we'll bring the jury. You can start getting the jury, I believe.